My aim in my message this morning is to convey two things. First, that spiritual growth requires us to reach, to strive, to work, to aspire, and that if the building blocks of our faith don't support that reaching, we're either doing it wrong or the tools themselves are insufficient. Second, that the seventh principle of Unitarian Universalism, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part, is an extraordinarily powerful tool for spiritual growth if we let ourselves engage it meaningfully. Within my message, then, I hope you will hear two invitations: an invitation to engage in active, meaningful, life-enriching spirit building, and an invitation to do that work in part by asking hard questions and demanding answers from the inherited theological ground upon which our Christian and UU identities are constructed. I need you to hear this. Meaningful religious experience, powerful meaning making, expansive and life-enhancing spiritual growth lies in your hands, in your willingness to engage. Passive experience of a worship experience may provide comfort, but it will not change your life. And my friends, for the sake of us all, our fundamental tethering to one another and to all the inhabitants of the world in which we draw life's breath and drink the living water, our world needs us to grow our souls. In his book, The Sound of Life's Unspeakable Beauty, German luthier Martin Schlesky uses his knowledge and his experiences as a violin maker to illuminate his relationship to God. Beginning with his specialized understanding of which trees are best to source the raw materials of his trade and why, and then working in conversation with those materials to craft instruments that maximize their collective potential, and then sending the end of his labors out into the world as tools, as gifts that unknown musicians now and in the future might inspire themselves and their audiences through their relationship to sound and imagination. What can this instrument do in my hands? What song does it need to sing? I would be remiss if I didn't take a moment to simply plug this book, because I'm reading it as slowly as I can, and I am rolling his words and his ideas around in my mouth like pieces of artisanal chocolate. Schlesky's ideas, indeed his vocation itself, have reinvigorated for me the seventh principle of Unitarian Universalism: respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. He begins by sharing how those who craft wood instruments find the trees that will allow themselves to sing. In the old days, he says, violin makers would stand by the rivers down which logs were being transported, and they would listen for the sounds that they made as they collided. They were practicing the art that Mary Oliver points to, and attention is the beginning of devotion. Some of these logs, the singers, would vibrate and sound. And it turns out that those logs came from trees that grew under specific high altitude, physically challenging conditions. If you want to make an exceptional violin, you must first find a tree that possesses great strength. Trees that grow in tightly populated forests at high altitudes have developed attributes that let them sing. And this contrasts with the lowland firs, which, Schlesky informs us, shoot up quickly, so they have wide annual rings. And the cells themselves have thick walls and short fibers and are not resilient. Their limbs start low on the trunks, and in their mild climates, they grow their heavy, dark wood long into autumn, and the resulting high proportion of winter grain ruins the sound. With the mountain giants, it's different. These firs cast off their lower branches in the course of their slow growth. In the dark mountain forests, they stretch their green crowns of branches upward towards the light. And the lower branches die off because their needles no longer reach the light. The difficult climate in which they root lends them great strength. In this substance lies the sound. So I say that the principles of Unitarian Universalism are aspirational, that faith isn't meant to be easy no matter what you express faith in. And this is mirrored by the nature of these trees that grow to be singers. An easy existence doesn't allow our spiritual lives to develop depth and resonance. An authentic life is not a path through the lowlands where things grow quickly and are easy to find, says Shlusky. Let's take a step back and ask ourselves about that living water of which Audrey shared from the Christian scriptures, that living water that Joy Williams is playing with in her parable of the hermetically sealed scientists. There are those who interpret the living water referenced in the Gospels as being Jesus himself. But it's pretty clear from both the passage we received today and a later passage in John that Jesus views belief itself as the living water. For Jesus, it is a belief in God, a belief in the power of God to change a person's life. But for those among us who don't identify as theists, might it be interpreted as respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part? Placing these readings and their respective theological orientations next to each other, we see Jesus hinting to the Samaritan woman, someone whose cultural identity was marked by his own tradition as unclean and was additionally outcast from her own people, doubly distanced from the source, one might say. Jesus suggests to her that she possesses a spiritual thirst, a longing that can only be filled by the living water of faith in something bigger. And as for the misguided scientists who think so little of the quality of water that their innovations turn the quenching water of faith into something terrible, something itself unclean, who saw living water as a metaphor and not as, living water. What these scientists forgot to do was respect the interdependent web of all life. One reason the principles must be viewed aspirationally is that if they aren't aspirational, they don't ask much of us. And if they don't ask much of us, then it is true what they say. Unitarian Universalists can believe whatever they want. And to my mind, that's not much of a faith. In my experience, some people diminish the seventh principle by viewing it solely as a quest for sustainability, by asking where our food comes from or what carbon resources were burned so that we might have reliably plump strawberries in winter, or take a Caribbean vacation when a New England February settles heavy on our mood. It is not wrong to view this principle as an invitation to ask questions about our individual impacts on the world. But viewing that as its primary intent diminishes the worth of the seventh principle as a theological tool to enrich and deepen our relationship with the sacred, to attend that we might devote. The seventh principle suggests to us that we are intimately connected and profoundly dependent on one another. And what that means is that we also need to use this to get to an infusion of new ideas, new ways of thinking, new ways of understanding each other and ourselves, to perform that act of florilegia that is this service, to ask what we can learn from each other because of our interdependence, to play old songs on new instruments, to make new instruments out of old wood. As with all of the seven principles, looking at verbs is illustrative. For this one, what are the implications and limitations of respect? Depending on which definition we're working with, we might be admiring the web, its glittering dewdrops and its architectural wonder. But does admiration ask us to do anything on its behalf? Respect might lead us to treasure it, to admire it, to cherish it, to value it, maybe even to revere it or worship it or idolize it. But all of those are relational actions. My reverence or cherishing demands only that I carve out a fondness for the concept. I might still engage in web-destroying behaviors. Another definition suggests that respect asks that I have due regard for the feelings and wishes and rights of the object of my respect, that I bear it in mind as I go through my day, that I pay attention to it. The last definition in my dictionary suggests that to respect, I must avoid harm or interference. I wonder if you agree with me that none of these definitions independently really capture the fullness of what our relationship to the interdependent web could be aspirationally. I can admire or esteem or treasure this symbolic web, and I can put it behind glass in a museum and marvel at its beauty and still spoil the world. I need to add in the second definition that asks me to keep in mind the rights or wishes of that web as I make life's decisions, decisions that also calculate into elements of the third definition, where I avoid harm like a lifestyle Hippocratic oath. In considering the interdependent web, first, do no harm. But if I do no harm out of a sense of obligation instead of reverence, have I respected it? If I honor it as an object that possesses rights, are those rights inviolable? Mary Oliver's words ring loudly again. Attention is the beginning of devotion. Only if I let myself notice over and over again will I allow myself to fall in love. And only if I fall in love will I actively work to keep this object of my devotion safe from harm. This is the message that Jesus gave as well. Respect, attention, devotion that bring us to humility and generosity and vision. The story is told of 3 workers at a construction site. Each one had a shovel with which they were digging in the ground. The first seemed listless and tired, and someone asked the first, what are you doing? I'm digging a hole. The second seemed happier. Someone asked the second, what are you doing? We're laying the foundation for a big wall. The third was also digging away, but this worker was laboring tirelessly, defying exhaustion with a demeanor of joy and devotion to the work. Again, the question, what are you doing? We're building a cathedral. The first worker uses an I statement, sees their work as individual, disconnected, personally laborious, and possibly meaningless. The second worker recognizes that there's a we involved and that the collective is doing something that has value. But the third joins the collective and also understands something about the dream, the aspiration, the time span of creation, about the beauty of what might be imagined and the gift of handing oneself over to something bigger than time. The reverence demanded of us by this principle, the noticing, invites us to be awestruck by the minutiae within our lives, over and over and over again. In the course of human history, we have discovered fire literally and figuratively billions of times, and yet each time it can dazzle if we allow it to. But there's nothing easy about that. It asks us to redirect our thoughts away from distractions and toward focus, away from the mundane and toward the sacred, over and over and over again. To say no to the industries that seek to monetize and monopolize our attention, to follow the example of Jesus and flip the tables in the temple. To hold ourselves and one another to a standard of care and love that is as massive an undertaking as building a cathedral over hundreds of years. To subvert human psychology that has evolved to prioritize safety by making in-groups and out-groups and giving us connection to those with whom we share similarity and those that we feel to be different, holding them at a distance. Whether that be humans or animals or plants or geological strata from which our obsession has estranged us. We are invited by this principle to notice and notice and notice again, to listen for the singers, to turn them into something new and different, to bang against each other and discover that sound can be more beautiful when it is done interdependently. May this be so. Amen.